We talk, we text, we email, we spend so much time communicating. But what if there are more ways to connect? Today, we are looking at some really interesting ideas well, about a different type of communication.
Different indeed. And it's being explored in some amazing ways in the non-speaking community, particularly through something called the Telepathy Tapes.
And we'll be going into some big claims for you, especially if you're here to get all the info fast.
Yeah, so we've got two big things we're focusing on today. We're going to be diving deep into Ky Dickens's interview on the Joe Rogan Experience. She really brought these experiences to a huge audience there. And then we're going to go even deeper into the Telepathy Tapes podcast itself.
Okay.
We'll be pulling out the key insights from the people sharing their stories, trying to get at this whole phenomenon of telepathy.
Our mission in this deep dive is to understand these claims of telepathy within the non-speaking community, as presented by Ky Dickens and the people featured on her podcast.
Excellent.
And we know you come with all sorts of backgrounds and experience with this topic, so we'll try to keep it clear, engaging, and definitely no unnecessary jargon.
Right.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so starting with the JRE interview, Ky Dickens appearing on Joe Rogan's show really was, a lot of people's first introduction to these ideas. What really stood out to you from that conversation?
Well, it was really interesting to see Rogan's openness, even like a feeling he'd had for a long time that maybe there's more to nonverbal communication than just what we, can physically see.
Right.
But then there's this real contrast with the skepticism that Dickens mentioned. People who are understandably a little hesitant to believe something so outside of our normal understanding.
Yeah.
What was really interesting to me, though, was the really strong positive response from families and teachers of non-speaking children.
Yes.
I mean, that kind of firsthand experience says that something big is going on.
Right. And I think to really understand this, we need to understand that the telepathy tapes focuses mostly on non-speaking individuals, many of whom have apraxia.
Right.
This is important. Apraxia is where, there's that disconnect between the mind and being able to control the muscles that you need for speech.
Yeah.
And their main way of communicating is through spelling to communicate, pointing at letters on a board or a device.
Right. And Dickens really highlighted this critical assumption that's been made historically, which is this lack of presumed competence in non-speaking individuals just because they can't speak.
Yeah.
And that's not the case.
Right. And so this makes their central claim even more important, which is that beyond the spelling, many non-speaking individuals display what are described as spiritual gifts, with telepathy as a main one.
Spiritual gifts, that's a big term. What does that actually include? Like, based on what Dickens and the people on the podcast have said.
Yeah, it's a huge range of experiences. There's things like the ability to know about an illness in themselves or others even before, a doctor's diagnosed it.
Wow.
And then there's these claims of, seeing auras around people, animals, and even plants.
Wow.
And then, some people are even said to be able to speak multiple languages without ever being taught. Almost like savant skills just emerging.
Right.
And then there are also, musical abilities, things like perfect pitch or knowing songs that they've never heard. So it's really this huge spectrum of these claimed abilities, suggesting that they're experiencing the world and interacting with it in a way that goes way beyond what we think of as normal sensory perception.
It's really making us question what communication even is, and what human potential might be.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Are there any other abilities that would fall under this spiritual gifts umbrella?
Oh, for sure. So they talk about dream bridging, which is where people visit people in their dreams. And then there are these really wild stories about, spellers who feel like they can actually perceive the world through other people's senses, like seeing through their eyes or hearing through their ears. And then there are even experiences described where it seems like the non-speaker and someone close to them are kind of like sharing a consciousness.
Merged consciousness? That's really, really hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. Dickens talks about this mom who thought that her son spelled the word paint when she was thinking about a messy food fight with ketchup and mustard. Mm-hmm. And it really shows that this isn't just like straightforward mind reading. It's something way more subtle and complex.
Yeah, it really makes you think that maybe our models for how the mind works are just too limited.
Mm-hmm.
And Dickens also mentions Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who was a skeptic but then became interested in all this.
Mm-hmm.
Having a scientist like him, who's really well respected, be curious about it, well, that definitely adds something to the discussion.
It does. And Joe Rogan, he asked a really good question in the interview. Why now? Why are these things, these claims, coming out now?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. What are some of the reasons that they gave?
Well, it seems like there's a few things happening. There's this growing openness among parents and teachers who are actually seeing these abilities,
Mm-hmm.
the non-speaking individuals they're working with. And, just the Telepathy Takes podcast itself has been huge, just having this platform where these stories can be shared.
Yeah.
It's made more people feel safe to share their experiences.
Yeah.
Dickens even talked about a 19-year-old who felt okay sharing his telepathic abilities after hearing the podcast.
Oh.
So it's creating this sense of community,
Yeah.
and making people feel validated.
So the podcast is creating this space where these experiences are like acknowledged and shared.
Right. And there's this one example, there's a teacher who has thought sharing time in her classroom.
That's amazing.
So it's starting to really change things in real life. It's like we're going from these isolated miracles that no one believes to something that's actually happening in the community.
And we can't ignore the impact of just believing, right?
Yeah.
You see with things like the placebo effect,
Yeah.
what we expect can really change how we experience things.
For sure. And Dickens kind of touches on this idea that belief and trust can maybe help develop these abilities.
Mm-hmm.
She also has this really interesting idea. She says that maybe this isn't like a new ability, maybe it's something we're all born with but have just forgotten because of technology.
Right.
And all the verbal communication that we do now.
That's a fascinating idea. Like we've maybe kind of lost these more intuitive ways of communicating.
Right.
It's really interesting.
And then they also briefly talk about how altered states of consciousness, like from psychedelics, might increase these abilities.
Yeah. Well, Rogan, always curious, wanted to know how telepathy actually works, right?
Yes.
What's the mechanism?
Mm-hmm.
And he asked if Ky Dickens has tried to like develop these abilities herself.
Yeah, she said she tried meditation, but that right now she's really focused on sharing the stories of the non-speaking community.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And thinking about our listener, you might be a little skeptical.
For sure.
I mean, telepathy is not something we normally think of as scientifically proven.
Right.
It's not really part of our culture.
And Dickens acknowledges that we see telepathy through this cultural lens, but she makes a really good point. She reminds us of all these everyday experiences we all have, like suddenly knowing that someone you love is in trouble or having a dream that feels so real. We often just think they're coincidences, but maybe they're showing us that we all have some intuitive, maybe even telepathic ability.
So the JRE interview really set the stage for these amazing claims and the people who are making them. What would you say is the main thing we should take away from this part of our deep dive?
From Ky Dickens' point of view, the non-speaking community are like the experts on this. Yeah. Their experiences are super important, and maybe they can help us understand communication and consciousness in a whole new way.
Okay, so we've explored the JRE interview.
Yeah.
Now let's dive right into the telepathy tapes.
Let's do it.
What specific stories and themes from the podcast really expand on what Dickens talked about with Joe Rogan?
Yeah, well, the podcast gives us a much more personal connection to these experiences. Take Sammy, for instance. She describes her community's impact as a ripple effect, first shattering reality for parents, then for schools. And she talks about the resistance they face because of, that very common seeing is believing mentality and this need for hard scientific proof. But her key point is that, their mission isn't to fit into the way we see things now. It's to completely change how the world sees them and their abilities. It's really powerful.
Yeah, it really points to that clash between lived experience and what science says, right?
Right, exactly. And then there's Trevor, whose mother, Laura, actually, she tested his telepathic abilities informally after she listened to the podcast. She used numbers and words, and she said he was 100% accurate.
Yep.
Yeah, really interesting. And Trevor's message is this need to be seen differently, not just as intelligent, but as having these spiritual gifts. He's a big advocate for presumed competence and calls for more compassion and understanding. He actually calls himself and others light workers.
Wow.
Yeah. So these direct tests, even if they're not, scientific, they're still really compelling personal stories.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's really interesting to see parents willing to explore this stuff.
It is. We also hear from a non-speaker in England who talks about feeling almost imprisoned by a system that doesn't recognize their potential. They say their minds are ultra functioning.
Right.
And they want people to rethink how they see physical disabilities. Like maybe disabilities are linked to even more brain activity.
It's an amazing thought.
It is. It's like
Yeah.
flipping everything we think we know on its head.
Yeah.
They also talk about the need for non-speakers to become leaders, and they're very critical of the current medical system.
Right.
Yeah, so a lot to think about there.
This idea of like an ultra functioning mind in a non-speaking body is so powerful.
It really is.
It really challenges how we think.
And there's this big theme that comes up over and over again in the podcast, and that's interconnectedness. This idea that we are all connected and that our thoughts can actually change the world around us, even if we don't speak them out loud. It's this really, really holistic view of consciousness.
It's almost like they're hinting at a collective consciousness.
Exactly. And Noah's sister, Adriana, she has this really sweet insight. She says that every child is born with what she calls spirit eyes, and this ability to be telepathic, but that this gets lost or broken down by how we're taught to behave, by being trained to only communicate verbally. And it makes you think about what Dickens said about these abilities being suppressed.
So it's the way we're raised and the way we're taught to be that limits these abilities.
Yeah, that's what they're suggesting. And we also hear directly from Maria's students.
Right.
A lot of them talk about how important it is for schools to see their full potential, to treat them like they're just as smart as anyone else. They talk about the need for trained spelling partners, for classrooms that are sensory neutral, where spellers can feel comfortable in their bodies.
Right.
And they're really clear that they have the right to be at their own medical appointments. They even encourage the listeners to get trained in spelling to communicate, or RPM.
Wow.
So they're actually giving us concrete steps that we can take.
Real actions to make a difference in their lives.
Yeah, exactly. And one of Maria's students, who they call Speller 1, he says he wants to fix all the misinformation about communicating with spirits. And he talks about how he's not as afraid of death anymore after his dad passed away, and how he finds comfort in this thought sharing and spiritual connection. He also says that he sees auras and describes them as being violet, blue, and green.
That's so interesting.
It is. He also says that telepathic connection only happens when there's love and acceptance. He even compares sending thoughts to sending emails. He says it's this special spiritual way of connecting with people. And a lot of spellers say this, that I only go in if there's love and acceptance and kindness.
That focus on love and acceptance and kindness is really powerful.
Yeah, it is. And then there's Anthony. He has this big picture idea. He wants a world based on compassion, not power. And he believes that everyone is love deep down, but that our minds kind of cover that up with things like guilt and shame.
Yeah.
He thinks compassion can change the world, even without words. It's a really hopeful vision.
A vision of a world where these deeper connections are really valued.
Right, yeah. And then Daniel, he speaks through his mom, Connie. He describes telepathy as really, really fast and complete. Like everything comes in at once, he says. And he actually sees facilitated communication as just a first step, just training wheels. And he even uses the letterboard to confirm what he's saying telepathically because his mom still had some doubts. And what's really interesting is that Daniel doesn't think this is a special gift. He thinks it's something we all used to have but forgot.
Yeah.
And that connects back to what we were saying earlier,
About this lost human ability.
Exactly. Yeah. And towards the end of the podcast, Sammy comes back with some really strong thoughts. She says that the telepathy tapes is shattering people's illusions about what's real, revealing all these human abilities that we normally can't see. And she's pretty critical of ABA, applied behavior analysis. She thinks it tries to train people out of their natural ways of being. And she says that in a way, we've all been trained to think in these limited ways. And she thinks our consciousness exists on a different level, a deeper reality. And she says we need to break down all these false ideas so that the new human can emerge. It's really challenging how we normally see things.
It's radical. It's making us think differently about how we understand and treat people who are different.
Right. And then Lily ends with this really passionate plea. She wants people to stop denying that spelling is real communication. She wants to be believed, She wants people to see the beauty and potential of their minds. She talks about their love, their pain, and how much they long to be included. She also talks about how beautiful and unique the autistic experience is.
Yeah.
And how much they want to learn to be included and to be valued.
It's a really moving and direct look into their world.
It is. John Paul, he talks about how groups of non-speakers communicate with each other telepathically. He says it's like they all tune into the same channel, sharing information, hope, and prayers no matter where they are in the world.
Wow.
And he calls this connection the hill. Like it's this center point of consciousness they can all access.
So the hill is like this telepathic network.
Yeah, exactly. And then Katie in Houston, they had this experience that really backs up this idea of the talk on the hill. They got a message from a mom in Utah whose son, who they'd never met, said Houston was his best friend.
Oh, wow.
So it really seems like they had this connection that wasn't physical.
That's amazing. That really supports what John Paul was saying.
Right. And Dr. Diane Powell, she brings this really valuable scientific perspective. She says that telepathy could be a kind of savant skill.
Oh, interesting.
You know, this ability that you can't explain with normal learning. And she compares it to other savant skills, like those people who can do those incredible calendar calculations, or they're amazing at math or music, or they can pick up languages really quickly.
Right.
She talks about Daniel Tammet, who has synesthesia and can recite pi like it's nothing.
Right.
And Dr. Powell says that these savant skills challenge this idea that consciousness only comes from the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And then she points out how weird it is that we accept savant skills, but not ESP or telepathy.
Yeah.
Like, why is one okay and the other one not? And she even mentions Bernie Rimland, who studies autism, and he thought ESP was a kind of savant skill, too.
So maybe if we see telepathy as a savant skill, it'll be easier for science to accept.
Yeah, that's the hope. But Dr. Powell also talks about how there's a lot of resistance to these ideas in the scientific community, people don't want to talk about it. And she shares her own story about how she was fined and lost her medical license for doing research on ESP.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can see that there's a real risk for scientists and parents who even want to explore these things.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is. And Lily's dad, Scott, who's a radiologist, he has this really interesting analogy. He compares telepathy to technology, like an MRI.
Right.
You know how MRIs can pick up these subtle signals in our bodies? He thinks maybe our minds can pick up certain frequencies or signals that we just don't understand yet.
That's a good analogy. It takes this kind of mystical idea and relates it to something we all know.
Exactly. And then John Paul explains that all the activity he was talking about on the Hill is probably because of how excited the non-speaking community is. They think the telepathy tapes might really change how people see them.
Yeah.
And Caroline, a caregiver, she says she has telepathic connections with the kids she takes care of all the time.
Oh, wow.
And she says it's actually really common among teachers and caregivers, but they're all scared to talk about it.
So maybe these connections are happening all around us, but we're just not talking about them.
Yeah, exactly. And then Kyle, who's a non-speaker, he communicates telepathically with his mom, Caroline, through lucid dreaming.
Oh, yeah, interesting.
They call it dream bridging, and they use it to talk about their needs and share information, and Kyle thinks of it as a spiritual ability.
That's amazing. It shows how these abilities can actually be used in everyday life.
Right. And then finally, Arthur Golden talks about how in the beginning of the facilitated communication movement, people decided not to talk about telepathy because they were worried it would make people not believe in FC, right?
And he talks about his son, Ben, who's part of a conservative Jewish community, and he does what they see as telepathic and spiritual communication, and it's totally accepted in their community. And he also points out that even though telepathy is amazing, it's still really important to have a way to communicate that everyone understands and accepts,
Yeah.
like spelling, because the world is still pretty skeptical.
So even with all this talk about telepathy, it's still crucial to have like a recognized way to communicate like spelling.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So that non-speakers can be heard and understood, whether or not people believe in telepathy.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. We started with Ky Dickens on the JRE, and then we went deep into all the different stories and perspectives on the telepathy tapes.
And what I think is so compelling is how many people are saying that telepathy is real in the non-speaking community. It's not just a few stories, it's this huge pattern all over the world. It really changes how we think about communication and consciousness and what humans are capable of. And for you listening, we hope this has been a real aha moment.
Yeah. It's really important to remember that these people who are sharing their experiences, they're not trying to trick anyone. They're showing us their world. And they want to be understood and included in a world that often doesn't get them.
And we really hope that this deep dive has given you a good understanding of this fascinating topic. So our final thought for you is, What if telepathic communication is more common than we think? What would that mean for how we understand consciousness itself? How would it change our understanding of connection? And what potential might be hidden inside all of us? Imagine how society and science would change if these claims were accepted and studied. It's a whole new world to think about.